Hello again and welcome to Sporting Memories and Goldster. My guest today is a world champion sportswoman who broke one of the most rigid ceilings in television. Sally Jones was an outstanding all-round sportswoman at school and at Oxford, where she represented the university at tennis, squash, netball, football, cricket, and modern pentathlon, as well as becoming the university's rock and roll champion. She cut her teeth in regional television before joining the BBC to become the first woman sports presenter in mainstream news. And she was a key member of the team that launched Breakfast News way back in 1983. She also found time to win 3 world titles at real tennis, commentate on the radio, and write several books. She's now a media consultant specialising in sport, health, and education. So welcome, Sally.
Hi, Alastair. I remember your sport very well from Cambridge, and I got friends at Cambridge who, they were always bragging about knowing you. So
well,
you've got a hell of a track record yourself.
Was reciprocated, yeah. Nice to see you. Nice to finally meet up. We've tried this 3 times, and various technological problems have failed to get in the way. But it's an absolute pleasure to catch up with you again from all those years ago. And the purpose of this is to just have a chat about your life and your career, and what things you've learned and so on. So, how did you get into sport in the first place?
Really, all my family were all-rounders. I had an uncle who played second team cricket for Warwickshire. My gran, who was a big influence, called Madeline, and we called our daughter after her, had played everything really well. She played hockey for the West of England. She'd been a really good local tennis player, and she was absolutely determined. She was one of those people who, if she put her mind to something, she would do it. 3 of her brothers were Olympic standard runners, and my great-grandfather used to pay for them to have athletics lessons, which was, from not a very well-off family. He was the bank. I think he was in the bank, and there wasn't a lot of money sloshing around, but sport was very much top of the tree. Everybody ran, everybody swam, everybody played tennis, cricket, whatever was going. If there was a ball and a stick or a bat, they would play it. And so I just grew up liking to have a go at things. And as a little kid, about 4, I would hit the ball for hours against the garage wall of the house where we were living in Bretby in Derbyshire. Then my dad got moved to a small branch at Coleshill near Birmingham. And directly above the manager's office, there was an entirely empty room. It was an 8-bedroomed house that we were, I think we were sort of put in there for about a year and a half while we tried to find somewhere to buy. So we were just renting it. And there was a wood-lined room, entirely empty and echoey. And I'd go in there with a lawn tennis racket and a table tennis ball. And I'd go ping, pong, pong, ping, pong, pong, hitting the ball against the wall for hours on end. And if my father was in there with a customer, this would last for about another 5 minutes. And then there'd be a terrible roar from down below. And he'd come absolutely belting up and says, "Get that, racket out of your hand. Don't ever go in there again." And then I started playing on the public courts with my mum. And I realised actually from sports days at school that I wasn't particularly very fast over a short distance. I was fairly well upholstered. I wasn't particularly fast over 100 meters, but what I could do was sort of read games and sort of see which way a game was going. And also I was willing to work to get really fit or to get stronger or go and skip for hours on end. And so first of all, I started off at aged about 10 playing on public courts with my mum, who loved her tennis. And then when I was about 11, I joined the local club. And there, I actually got to play in the final against my former junior school teacher when I was about 12. And it was a big thing because this lady had been the number 1 in the club, a very small club just by the church at Coleshill. And I'd squeaked through that match, and it gave me such a big boost, and that sense of winning, and winning at admittedly quite low level, senior level. Yeah. As well as winning a competition at school. And I was a terrible old pot hunter. I loved having the sideboard full of cups and things and medals, and whether it was swimming or, wildflower collecting or whatever it was, I always wanted to be the best. And I was just prepared to put the work in. So I then found that tennis at that stage was my real love, and was lucky enough to win the under 12 county close tournament. It was my second tournament I'd gone in for. I hadn't had any coaching much, so it was just determination. It was being prepared to run and run and run and just shovel the ball back any old how. And you got some of these quite well-off juniors who'd had years of coaching, but they were all nicely sort of schooled little strokes. And I didn't mind what I did, whether it was a drop shot or a lob or messing around or, you know, trying to kind of give the people the shot that they didn't like. Also having a long reach and liking to go to the net. So I just, suddenly I found myself going to the nationals after I'd been playing tennis for about a year and a half, which was a bit scary, because I came up against all these people like Sue Barker, all the good Devonians, a girl called Linda Mottram, who was the then Davis Cup captain's daughter, and they were amazing. I mean, I was beaten off the court. I lost all 5 matches that I played, and I came home absolutely determined that I could see now what the standard was like, and it obviously wasn't going to cut it. The Midlands wasn't particularly strong as a tennis area then, so I thought, right, back to the drawing board. I've really got to start working now, and so that was what really gave me the incentive to start training. And I got a coach. I used to go to Warwickshire County training. I loved being part of a team. I wasn't the best by any means, but I just loved being in a team and playing doubles and, you know, just sort of gradually, bit by bit, to improve. And people you lost to the year before, you could gradually, bit by bit, get better than. And then, you know, won various tournaments, and we won the British Junior Schoolgirls Doubles Championship, my partner and I, at Queen's Club, which was a huge thrill. And all the way back on the train, we sat in the compartment with this great big cup between us, sort of showing it off to everybody who went past. So I've never been a slave to false modesty, I'm afraid.
Brilliant. So it started with at home, the family encouragement. What about at school and so on? Or was it all club based, or was there encouragement at school?
School was very important. There was a girl about 3 years older than me at school who I absolutely worshipped. She was called Sue Cogswell, and she was later, I think, British national champion at squash. Yes. And she was also world #2 behind Heather Mackay. And she was one of these people who could literally pick up a ball or a bat or a stick and be good at it. She was an under-23 hockey international, amazing at tennis. You know, she's good, nationally ranked, I think probably about 6, 7 in Britain at tennis in her age group. And then I had the chance when I was about 12 to be able to play with her in the first team at school, because her partner had left the previous year. And I was so terrified of messing it up that I would stand almost off the court. And we would play all these various local pairs, you know, from Malden College and all the schools in Birmingham. And I would be just praying that the ball wouldn't come to me, because I'd be so much in awe of Sue Cogswell, who I thought was almost divine, that I would be literally praying that I didn't have to hit it. And in the end, she said, "Don't be ridiculous. You get on that net and your job is to put the ball away." And then she was great, because she made a joke about all of our opponents. She'd give them nicknames like Limpy Lorna and Midriff Bulge and names like that. And I used to follow her around at school at a safe distance. She got slightly turning in toes, and I used to follow behind her, trying to walk like her, in the hopes that if I'd got that sort of slightly athletic tramp with the toes slightly turned in, that I too would be as good at sport as she was. Alas, I wasn't. It didn't stop me trying.
But alongside that at school was the academic side. I mean, now from our vantage point, it was always school and academia, school and sport, because that's the way it was. Was that what was the balance between the two for you?
Well, I mean, it was almost all sport for me, I'm afraid, because I was all set to go to Bedford PE College. I sort of filled in my application, and I was all set to try for there. And I was 17. And one of my great friends from a local convent, who'd been one of my doubles partners in the county team, came and said she was coming to our school, which was quite academic, King Edward's High School. And I'd been lucky enough to get a free place there as an 11-year-old. So that gave me the chance to do all the Birmingham things. I had to travel about an hour and a half each day by train and bus to get to school. But once I was there, if I was playing, say, county netball or going to practice of some sort, it was all nearby. So it gave me a lot more opportunity to do things, probably to do competitive stuff. So anyway, this girl, Jane, came to my school, and I was delighted because we could play tennis, and she was busy doing Oxbridge exams to do French. And then I thought, goodness, I mean, I thought that everybody that went to Oxbridge was sort of Mekong-brained, with a brain the size of Devon, and that it wasn't for the likes of me. I thought, well, if someone who plays that much tennis is trying for Oxford, why shouldn't I at least have a try? Yeah. And so I said to my English teacher, because I loved English, and I'd always written a lot. I'd written poetry and creative writing, and just sort of was generally interested. I said, what about me trying for Oxford? And her jaw sort of hit the floor, and she said very carefully, well, you've got as good a chance as anybody, which I think translated meant, forget it, pal, but you might as well have a go anyway. And then I went into the changing room to change for netball or something a couple of days later. And I was hidden behind a row of coats. There were a gang of girls in one corner. And one of them was the sort of the school English geek who was an absolute shoo-in, everybody thought, called Julie. And she said, Sally Jones, try for Oxford. Don't make me laugh.
Red rag to
so I thought, blow this. So I actually really pulled my finger out at that point. And I mean, I'd always read a lot, but people at school, because I didn't get particularly good O-level grades, I was too busy playing netball, and I'd been in Midland schools, and I'd had an England trial and things for netball, so that was a big interest during the winter as well. So I was basically always on a court or, playing a game of some sort. Yeah. And then the problem was that I then had to try to convince people that I actually could do it. So anyway, they let me apply, and I did start working a little bit better. And it just happened that the Oxford entrance exam had some really interesting questions that sort of got my imagination. It was things like, they would ask things like, I think, what was it? Oh yes, write a defense of cannibalism. And another of the questions was, satire can speak only to its age, discuss. And one of the things that I loved was Alexander Pope, which, obviously satire, and I liked the funniness of it, but Pope wasn't on any syllabus that year. And so I'd written on this, and because they were surprised that somebody hadn't written the normal neat little King Lear essay or, something more of what had been on a syllabus, I was invited in for an interview. And luckily the school had given me good sort of backing in what they might ask, because it was obviously going to be on the satire question. Yeah. So I was reasonably well prepared, but I think it was actually a great deal of luck as much as anything that I got through it. So
St. Hugh's, why St. Hugh's?
Somebody had said that it was a very sporty college, and that was where everyone that loved sport went. And when I got there, my father, who was very straight and Welsh Chapel, had said, or he'd heard that I'd also put London University as one of my options. Oh no, Sal, that's a terrible cesspit of vice and debauchery. You mustn't go to London. And I thought, oh goodness, if I fail Oxford, I'll end up going to Bangor or somewhere, which was my third choice. As it turned out, I didn't have to go to Bangor. That's where my dad was from, and he was very in favour of Bangor. But the very first week of Oxford, I found myself at a party with postgraduates, and they had the guy who was an American, very rich, very sort of showy-offy guy that always sort of wore a white fedora and boasted about his father's walk-in humidor on their Georgia estate. Came in with something that he said was best Congolese, and it looked like a load of sort of rabbit droppings and sort of bits of string, and it turned out to be some sort of cannabis, which I'd never been anywhere near. I'm rabidly anti-drugs and always have been. So as everybody else passed this reefer round, I was sort of sitting higher and higher up in my chair, and so I had to Alastair, I'm terribly sorry. I've got somebody come to the door who's our cleaner.
Okay.
Is it all right to break off for one
Yeah, come
second?
back.
I'm
When you come
really
back as soon
sorry.
as you can, that would be brilliant.
Sorry.
Wow, fantastic already, isn't it? Sally Jones' stories of school, growing up at school in Warwickshire and Birmingham, on to Oxford University. We'll talk about her television and further sporting career as well when she comes back. But an extraordinary personality, an extraordinary all-round sportswoman. I was lucky enough to be the same sort of vintage, in that I went up to Cambridge about the same time as she went up to Oxford, and we shared, we sort of operated in each other's orbits, really. You know, I heard all these stories about this wonderful sportswoman at Oxford, and I was enjoying my time at Cambridge. We had a mutual friend, so I met her when I was at university, little knowing that either of us were going to go on to the sort of careers that we did have. But you know, isn't it wonderful to talk to somebody who's had those sorts of experiences, and became a television glass ceiling breaker. Here she comes back again, but we're still on St. Hugh's and your undergrad experience.
Oh yeah,
people like it or
I'll do that story again a bit more compressed.
Wow.
Shall I do the first week at St. Hugh's?
Yeah,
that story. Yeah. Yes.
So it was a man with cannabis was trying to.
Yeah. Oh yes, I'll go. I was actually the first member of my family ever to go to university, and my father was very ambivalent about it because he'd always said, "Oh, you're 16, Sal. You could get a safe job in Lloyd's Bank, and if you keep your hand out of the till, you could be a manager by the time you're 40." And I'd seen what being a bank manager was like, and it meant a load of keys on a string and sort of having to work all hours and get down on your knees to do filing with the clerk if they didn't have a fly balance. So the last thing I wanted to do was banking.
Yeah.
So instead, I insisted on applying for university, and my father thought this was a terrible waste of money. And then he heard that I'd put as one of my choices London University. They were second behind Oxford. And oh no, Sal, it's a terrible cesspit of vice and debauchery. You mustn't go there. You must, knock that off the list straight away. And so oh Lord, if I fail Oxford, I've got to if I fail Oxford, I've got to go to Bangor University, which was where he was from. So anyway, that was an incentive to work as well. But when I first got to Oxford in my first week, I found myself at a party just outside Oxford with a load of rather well-heeled postgraduates. One of them, an American from the deep south, who was a very sort of smartly dressed guy, always wore a sort of white fedora and used to boast about his father's walk-in humidor for his cigars. So while we were there sort of having our drinks, he came in with a sort of tray of what looked like sort of rabbit droppings and bits of string, and he said it was best Congolese. I hadn't the first clue what best Congolese was, and it turned out it was some sort of cannabis. And I've always been rabidly anti-drugs and never take them, never would. And, I'm a real sort of proselytizer about drugs. So as everybody else passed the sort of reefer around, I was sitting higher and higher in my chair, trying not to breathe it in, because I thought you could get high on secondary smoking, which actually, given the thickness of the smoke in there, you probably could.
Yeah.
So it also turned out that one of my tutors was a lesbian who was having an affair with one of the domestic bursars. So when I got back to St. Hugh's, I immediately rang my dad and said, you said that London was a cesspit of vice and debauchery. I didn't go into too much detail because he'd probably taken me back straight away if he'd have realised what was going on in Oxford. Yeah. But actually, sport was one of my main focuses there rather than drink and drugs. There was a bit of rock and roll, as you know from the, thing. I always loved dancing. I'm not much of a dancer, but I'm enthusiastic, which is probably the main thing.
But still, how did you get to win the title though, of rock and roll champion at Oxford University?
My great friend Jane, who really is a fantastic dancer and was the reigning rock and roll champion of Oxford, and she was also president of the Oxford Rock Sock. And we used to go for lessons in an upper room in above one of the shops in Oxford, while Raymond and his partner Yvonne used to teach us this sort of rather neat little jives, and we preferred to do very long arm's lengths of throwing one another around and sort of, legs wrapped around somebody's waist being thrown over their head, that type of jiving. But anyway, we were made to do this jiving. And then at the end of term BOP, you had to do your jive, you see, and my partner and I have been practicing like anything. And eventually people get sort of tapped on the back, so they go to the side. So eventually there are just two couples left to jive off against one another. And a friend of mine, an American guy, and his partner were very, very much better jivers than us with beautiful footwork. But because quite a lot of the people there were either my tennis friends or people that I knew from elsewhere, the actual title was decided on audience applause rather than aesthetic qualifications. So I think we should definitely have been second or third, but
don't be so
because
modest.
the audience knew us, we got a big hand, modest, so we won the title. And an Eddie Cochran LP was the prize.
Oh, wonderful. Those lovely innocent days. Yeah. So, but I mean, the great thing about Oxbridge, I was lucky enough to have it for 4 years, was the balance. You had the social life, the sport, the academic, the historic buildings and so on. That's what I found at Cambridge. How was Oxford and the whole lifestyle for you?
I'd read Brideshead Revisited before I went up, and Decline and Fall by Evelyn Waugh, and I loved both those books. And I imagined that was what Oxford would be like. So I basically set myself the task of kind of recreating Brideshead. And actually, I mean, there are little pockets of, there are still one or two grand people living those extraordinary lives, although mostly it's sort of, earnest scientists beavering away in the Banbury Road. But there is a certain amount of fun and insouciance and sort of, we didn't quite keep little hairbrushes for our teddy bears, but there was quite a lot of posturing and going around dressed in drop-waisted dresses and going out punting and everything. And I was also part of, I'm a very bad tap dancer indeed, but they wanted a tap dancer to go with a local jazz band, a 20s jazz band, to get people up and bopping, which it's amazing how a tap dancer, however bad, will get everybody else up to try their hand at tap dancing or charlestoning or whatever. And so we went on no end of sort of riverboat shuffles and Mabels and things with that. And so it really was an idyllic time. I mean, I didn't work particularly hard. I worked enough to sort of get by. And it was lucky that I'd read a lot before I went up, because a lot of the time I was really sort of coasting by on things that I'd done before, or the fact that I'd always found writing what I liked to do. I mean, my tutors were fantastic. Marilyn Butler, who later became Professor of English at Cambridge, was my tutor for sort of 18th century. So she was great on things like Pope and Dryden. So it was fascinating, but I really wish I'd worked about twice as hard. I mean, the trouble was that if somebody said, "Oh, why don't you come along and trial for the Blue Boat?" or "Why don't you? We're going to start modern pentathlon for women." And so the moment somebody said, why don't we do such and such, I'd usually say yes. I'd probably have a better degree if I'd occasionally said no, but I'd been riding in the Oxford riding team and probably the worst person in it. And they were looking around for some women to become the three members of the first women's modern pentathlon varsity team to compete against Cambridge. I'd done everything except the shooting before, because I'd done a bit of fencing at school. I'd done a lot of swimming. Not a great runner, but I could sort of stagger around. And I'd ridden since I was a kid, so the riding wasn't too bad. And so at one stage I had to choose between trying to get in the Oxford Blue Boat, I don't know if I would have done, or going into the modern pentathlon squad. And because the pentathlon seemed like great fun, and it was the first time they'd had a women's varsity match, I opted for that. I wasn't that good at the 5 a.m. starts with the rowing anyway.
Yes, no.
It was fantastic. We rowed against the German universities, and we took on Cambridge at Uppingham. And actually, some of the friends I made, including those in the Cambridge team, it was competitive, but it was friendly as well. I mean, there was a wonderful sort of lightness of spirit about it, because we were the first people to have done it, so nobody was expecting that much of us. In fact, we've got the two other women in it were very high standard runners and riders. So luckily we beat the Tabs that year. But that was an incredible experience. But it did mean that I suddenly thought, goodness, what am I going to do after this? And I'd known that I liked writing, and I happened to see, I suddenly thought I need some background to show that I've got an interest in journalism, because if I went into any interview in my second year, I couldn't have shown the slightest sort of commitment to any particular job or career that I might go into. So a friend from Cambridge, Nuala Dwyer, who you know well, and I were the ones picked to go on the British University's tennis tour of ERA, of Southern Ireland.
Yeah.
We went and played at the Fitzwilliam Club in Dublin, where although we were probably higher standard than our male university counterparts, we were relegated to a back court just in case people should see that women could play tennis too. And then we went down to Cork and we had absolute scream, and they take it very, very lightheartedly down there. People play hard during the day, but then drink and carouse hard at night. And once they get down to the quarterfinalists, they auction people off at the tournament dance. They have a proper auctioneer, so that if somebody bids for and gets, well, somebody bid for and got me, and I wasn't seeded. Nuala was number one seed, and everybody knew she was likely to win it. I wasn't seeded, but somebody took a punt on me, and they bought me for a relatively small amount of money. And because I got into the final, it made them an absolute fortune, because they got 3/4 of the pot, whereas the person that they got a quarter of the pot, whereas the person who'd had to pay a lot of money for Nuala got 3/4 of the pot, which probably wasn't that big a difference between what they paid and what they won. But that was great fun, and I'd kept a diary all through this time. And so put all this sort of silly stuff in, just describing it. I mean, it was like something out of P.G. Wodehouse, a lot of it, but it was simply noting down what had happened. And then the Sunday Telegraph had a travel writing prize. So I just knocked it into shape, wrote 800 words from this diary, put it in, and to my great astonishment, won it, because there are just so many ridiculous things and unexpected things. I mean, we met a lot of members of the Young IRA when we were out clubbing in Cork, and they were showing us things like a handkerchief with all the signatures of the men in Long Kesh, the political prisoners in jail, embroidered in green by their girlfriends that were sort of living back at home, and making a kind of holy relic of it, pretty much. And so anyway, after that, that gave me the confidence to go to BBC Radio Oxford and say, will you teach me? Not much is being done about the university at the moment, and almost nothing on university sport, which is really high level. And a lot of several of the men rugby players were international standard, and a lot of the rowers were. So eventually, a lovely man called Tony Adamson, who was later one of radio's greatest commentators, the most wonderful, encouraging man, got me doing the most awful sort of tongue-tied talks on the radio, and then sent me off with a Ewer, which was a brick-sized tape recorder, to go and interview the women's rugby team. The women's rowing 8. So I did, and unfortunately, I didn't know that what you didn't do was say oh yes, after every answer. So all the way through, the moment somebody slightly paused, I go and then I spent an awful 3 hours with a razor blade and sort of sellotape stuff, taking out all the ums and sticking the tape back together again. It was a mistake you never make twice. If you've had to spend 3 hours doing that, you probably had to do the same at various times.
Well, part of the learning curve. But did that just breed the desire to be a journalist, or were you going to be a writer, or how?
I'd always wanted to be a print journalist, actually, but when I then put in for the BBC News Training Scheme and various of the newspaper training schemes, including the Mirror and others, and when the BBC training scheme came up, the fact that there were just 6 of us, and that you got your NUJ card straight away, and that you got the chance to be at Broadcasting House, right in the sort of epicenter of radio broadcasting, and working with people like Esther Ranson and Brian Redhead and all the great names of, and people like Libby Purvis, who'd been at Oxford. She'd come via Radio Oxford only about 3 years earlier, and she was about to become the presenter of the Today Show. So, there were some really amazing people. And there was a young, very unconfident girl called Moira Stewart, who was doing radio newsreading at that point, helped by the sort of doyen of the newsreaders then. There was a lovely man called Colin Doran. And I remember various conversations about, oh, she's rubbish, she keeps fluffing, etc. And luckily they stayed with her, because she became one of the great, newsreaders and announcers. And, again, one of the first Black people to present really successfully. And the most beautiful sort of deep and lovely husky voice. But the first few months for anybody, I think everybody sounds pretty rubbish unless you're, probably Desmond Lynam didn't, but the rest of us all sounded pretty rubbish. And then bit by bit, you gradually build up your confidence. Although I always knew probably that I wanted to do writing as my main thing at some stage.
Well, you're still thinking you're going to be a writer?
Well, I hope to build. I actually managed to do the two in tandem. Right. Because I spent a year as a BBC News trainee, and then having worked down in Plymouth on attachment as a sort of newsroom sub, just somebody writing away in the newsroom for radio and telly, I then saw that there was a sort of junior reporting job going at Westwood Television, which was the ITV show in Plymouth. And so I applied for that, never thinking I'd get it, and found that because I'd worked there fairly recently and I was pretty young, and I suppose they felt, they could mold me into what they needed. They took me on. And that was really so different from the BBC, because at the BBC, I'd probably have had to wait till I was about 30 to be a reporter, whereas at 22 or whatever it was, I was a reporter going all over, from the Isles of Scilly up to Dorset, along to Dorset, Somerset, the borders of Bristol and so on. I've never made more in mileage. And there were a couple of senior reporters there, and they used to vie for the furthest away job from Westwood Television in Plymouth. They once had a fist fight in a corridor over who should get the furthest job, which was probably in the Mendip somewhere. Yeah. And one of them said, if somebody cut into you, they'd find 23.4 pence a mile going through you like a stick of Edinburgh rock. That was the sort of magical sum. You got 23.4 pence a mile for every mile you could invent that you'd travel.
And what did those early experiences teach you about television and regional television?
I think it was the sheer variety of it. One day you'd be judging a cat show in Taunton, and the next you'd be sort of up above Dartmoor in a helicopter looking for, 4 youngsters were lost during the 10 Tours expedition. Yeah. And everybody was terrified that they died of hypothermia. And I was taken up in a helicopter with our cameraman to film the search going on, because it was the most appalling weather. Yeah, no. And the police, amazingly to me, had actually brought in a psychic to try to tell them where these kids were. And the psychic told them that they were in a wooded building on the east of the moor. And amazingly, the kids were found in a barn on the very east of Dartmoor. On the very east of Dartmoor. So you can see why the police use psychics quietly. I don't think they'll admit to it, but they do.
Yeah. Yeah. And was there a career path for you at the time, or were you just, you said you took the job that was in television because you heard it was going? Did you have a career trajectory you were aiming at? Or?
I wanted to work as a reporter for ITN at that point because I liked hard news.
Yeah.
And the very first day that I was working at Westwood, there was a steel strike on, and I sort of came with the idea that we should cover the steel strike in this way. And they said, oh, no, dear, you're going to do the fattest cat in Cornwall. Oh. So I was sent off to St Austell, and this great big fat moggy was there, and it was absolutely enormous. And it was something like 37 pounds of cat, huge. And the lady who owned it, I think, had just fed it and thought she was, being kind to it. So we were trying to illustrate this. We got a set of scales. We put the cat on the scales, and the cameraman was going to pan up, 38 pounds, that's 19 bags of sugar, or nearly 10 pounds of flour, or then get the cat in shot. One enormous moggy. And the camera started panning up, and at that point the cat went and leapt off
Yeah.
it didn't like the look of the camera. It leapt off the scales and went under the bed. And it took us about an hour and a half to sort of poke it out with sticks. But at least we didn't go and run over it on the way on the way home,
Yeah.
which somebody did with some special talking dog that they'd been filming, which was rather terrible. Thank goodness that wasn't me. But that was a story that ran and ran and ran. I just got so fed up with Fattest Cat in Cornwall stories.
Yeah.
And but it went to ITN. It was one of those stories that people just remembered because it was so silly. People kept coming up with cats that they thought were as fat as this cat. There was always a big weigh-in.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that you see everything from the ridiculous, the most absurd stories like that, right to kind of mass murders. And my next job, which was at HTV Wales in Cardiff, and I worked for a while as the North Wales correspondent. While I was up in North Wales, there were 4 lots of really awful murders, including one in which a son killed his mother. He was, I think, a disturbed teenager, and she tried to prevent him going down into the village and socializing much because I think he was a bit odd. And eventually he just killed her and hid out in only the clothes he stood up in and a pair of socks for the next 3 days in winter. And then came back to the farm about 3 weeks later when his cousin was there and was handed himself in. And he was actually defended by Lloyd George's nephew, who was a local solicitor. And because it was obviously, it was a psychiatric problem, he was eventually went to a psychiatric hospital rather than to prison. But, that as quite a young kid, it's quite a rapid learning curve. You grow up quite a lot doing those sort of stories. When I was at Westwood Television, it was the Jeremy Thorpe trial, and there were loads and loads of very graphic kind of evidence and detail coming in, and it was all coming in on long sheets of paper, which was obviously that it was well before there was any sort of digital news coming through. So we were having to get all of our stories off these these sheets of paper, and they all thought I was so innocent that I was the only woman on the television side of it. Then they actually took the sheets of paper and hid them in a box over lunchtime so that I shouldn't read them. So of course I waited till this made them absolutely irresistible. So I waited till they'd gone out of the room, climbed up on the box. I can now kind of almost recite you word for word all this awful evidence about, then he thought bit the pillow and Norman Scott did such and such. There was all sorts of dreadful stuff. So you do grow up quite fast, really.
But did you feel you were palmed off with the Fattest Cat in Cornwall rather than the more masculine stories? Did you feel there was sexism in the workplace?
I think that always happens when you're young. And I think probably if I'd been the youngest male reporter, I might have been, but particularly if you're a young girl, there was a lot of sort of maybe slightly misplaced gallantry then. I mean, I was from, fairly sheltered sort of background. So I can understand in retrospect why they weren't going to trust me with, the major court case or the big murder or whatever at that age. But I mean, once I started working as a freelance at ITN, and most of the stories that they were covering then were like that. So at the moment you can get into somewhere where those stories are commonplace, that's what you get. A guy called David Martin, who was a criminal who killed a policeman, had managed to escape from jail and had taken himself down the underground from Belsize Park towards Hampstead. And he was literally escaping the police and having to flatten himself into the sort of 7 inches or whatever it was between the side of the underground train and the tunnel as these trains came past. And I got the chance to do, sort of film part of the recapture and, recreate what it must have been like. I mean, he was a very skinny, thin guy, and it was only because he was that thin that he actually avoided being killed by one of the trains going through. It was terrifying kind of. Some of the stories were quite terrifying, but others were fascinating. And I would quite often I'd get given a sports story, because although I wasn't a sports reporter at that time, I'd started writing a sports column for the old now defunct Today newspaper that Eddie Shah started up, the first colour newspaper. That was the newspaper that really broke the sort of stranglehold of the unions in Fleet Street. And so I started writing a weekly column on women's sport for that. And yes, I mean that was fascinating, because you then got the chance to do all sorts of different stories, from G. Armitage being, you know, first crack at the first woman having first women in the Grand National, Charlotte Brew and people like that. And that was an amazing story. Oh yes, and as a result of that, I was doing some work for Channel 4 News and was sent up to cover the first cricket match that Boycott was playing in for Yorkshire after he'd had the year away back in the 1980s, when he'd been stripped of the captaincy and had stepped down for that year. And I went up to Leeds to do the coverage of this, and it looked as though looked all the way as though it was going to go. I think it was Nottinghamshire they were playing, and it looked all the way as though it were going to be a draw. And at the last minute, I think it was Yorkshire won it. I think it was that. It's so long ago, I can't remember. But certainly it all changed at the last minute. But the thing was, I was desperate to get an interview with Boycott, and I went up to him and asked him, "Oh no, I won't be being interviewed today." And then David Bairstow, the current wicketkeeper's father, came over and said, "Hey lass, you know he needs his palm crossing before he'll do an interview." And sadly, I mean, we just didn't have a budget at Channel 4 News. We didn't pay interviewees. So I ended up interviewing Bairstow instead. And he gave a wonderfully sort of colourful, interesting quotes, and probably much more interesting, possibly, than Boycott himself might have been.
I'll believe that. Yeah. I mean, how did breakfast, the Good Morning thing, start? How did that?
I think it was because they wanted I think they wanted a woman sports presenter. They'd seen that I was writing the column for the Today newspaper, and that I did some sports pieces. I'd occasionally do something on golf or show jumping or something. I was by then working at Central Television. So I was approached to do breakfast time, and that was working with Bob Wilson. And I didn't realise I'd be the first woman sports presenter. I went into it thinking, oh, it'd be interesting to see how this goes. And then I got there, and there was for about 2 weeks of nothing but publicity and first woman sports presenter and all this. And I had no idea that this was what it entailed. I just thought I'd go there like I'd been to my other jobs, and there might be something in the local press, but not a great deal. And suddenly you were sort of asked on to, well, not quite Parkinson, but half the chat shows and things like that, just because you were the first, not because you were necessarily very good, but because you were the first one to do it. And I came home from work one day to the little flat that I just managed to buy, a small flat fairly near White City, and got back, and my two downstairs neighbours were in absolute fever of excitement. "Oh, there's been a young man here. He wanted to know all about you. And he asked if you got a boyfriend." "Well, you haven't, have you?" We told him we didn't know. "Was he a commercial traveller of some sort?" No, he wasn't. It was somebody from, I think, the Sun or the News of the World. And it turned out that after they closed the door on him, he went and started rooting through the dustbins to find out if there was anything incriminating, which actually at that stage there wasn't, because I'm so bad at getting up in the mornings that I just couldn't have faced any more than just getting up, going to work, coming back, going to, doing my jobs and going to sleep. But there was one lovely driver who used to take me in a beautiful white BMW because it was too early in the morning for the tubes to be running, at about sort of 4:45 in the morning to get into the BBC, called Errol. And I would, he'd ring the doorbell, I'd go down, go into the show, and then he'd take me back afterwards. And he was always full of interesting suggestions, like, shall we go dancing, or shall we do this or that? I was usually too tired for this. And then one morning he said, "Shall I come a bit early tomorrow and run your shower?" And luckily I turned this down as well, because I said, it's a very kind offer, but I'm much too tired for any kind of shower running at that time of day. You'd absolutely kill for an extra hour of sleep.
Yeah.
But about 2 weeks later, Patty Caldwell, who was a friend of mine and was the BBC's consumer affairs correspondent at that time, was splashed all over the news of the world in a kiss and tell sort of sting. And it was Errol's common law wife who'd written a great big feature all about how, I mean, none of us had even known he'd got a common law wife or had little children.
Yeah.
And the awful headline was TV Patty stole my black stallion.
Oh God. Yeah.
And I was thinking, oh Lord, just imagine my mother if that had been me. And I just felt so sorry for Patty Caldwell, because at those days the BBC was incredibly judgmental. Well, I think all the national outlets would have been. And her career was pretty much stalled in its tracks there. You know, she went on to do other things, but I think that, you know, she was pretty much shoved aside fairly soon afterwards. And worst of all, the following week was Errol. I mean, I think she probably could have survived one bad headline, but the very next one was I Smoked Dope with TV Patty by Errol. And here was a man making probably 70 or 80,000 a year by being a driver in this lovely car and having to drive people very long distances, basically giving it all away for a few thousand from the news of the world because it was easy money. So it was a great lesson in looking at who you trust. And I mean, I was never a kind of A-list celebrity or anything, but I think for anyone who is, the question of trust must be.
But it was a revolutionary moment in British television. Did you feel that on the inside, that you were breaking all the bounds, not just yourself personally, but the breakfast program was a completely new type of program? Did you have that sense?
I think yes, it was a very different sort of atmosphere and style to the programs that had come before, which were mostly relatively staid. I mean, somebody like Frank Boff, although obviously he had his problems, a lot of bad problems later on, was an absolute unparalleled natural presenter and could just make you feel that he was sitting on the edge of the sofa chatting away to you alone, which I think is the great gift. And I think that's what all the very best presenters have got. People like, you know, Lynham in his day, and you know, Claire Balding, and a lot of the top presenters have had this absolute ease of manner, as though if everything folded and they were just down to one camera, they could keep you enthralled for the next hour. They didn't need any notes or anybody shouting in their ear. And it was a lovely atmosphere, actually. It was funny to think of the people that were on it, very hard news people like Jeremy Paxman, Kirsty Walk, Sally Magnuson, who was amazingly chirpy at all hours of the day and night. She's a lovely person. Well, they were all great, actually.
Yeah.
I'd gone there thinking, oh, Jeremy, this awful sort of sarcastic, curmudgeonly, grumpy bloke. But within about 3 seconds, I realised he'd got this wicked sense of humour, and a lot of that was a big sort of cover for somebody who got this terrific sense of humour, but also a very mordant sort of wit. Now, he would always deflate people. One of the best times was when he was interviewing the rapper Dizzy Rascal. And when it came to the second question, he said very politely, "Now tell me, Mr. Rascal." It just cracks me up, the thought of calling him Mr. Rascal. Because it was BBC form to call everybody Miss somebody or Mr. somebody.
BBC had an image, didn't it, of being straight-laced and collared. And were you sort of instructed to loosen your collars to?
Yes, we were.
Was it a sort of, or did it come naturally? Or
having done quite a lot of news reading in the regions, you were supposed to be quite straight. You know, you're wearing your nice sort of square-shouldered 80s sort of jackets. You know, that everybody wore the same sort of thing, usually in one bright colour. And you know, with BBC, we were actually sent out to have our colours red, so that because you know, they wanted to kind of transmit. I also worked on BBC World, which was broadcasting to Saudi Arabia and the Middle East. And so during those times, we were always expected to wear bright orange, yellow, pink, green, etc., because those were the colours that part of the world favoured. But certainly, even on breakfast news, we were encouraged to wear really, you know, sort of relatively informal, bright coloured. And when you looked at what ITV were doing, very informal, very chatty and jokey. I think there was always a little bit more of a reserve with the BBC because of it being the kind of national broadcaster. But we were certainly encouraged to be a lot less stiff and starchy. I mean, when you look at, say, Angela Rippon reading the news the first few times, I was one of the subs when she was first reading the news at TV Centre. I was on attachment there, and it was this incredible sort of rather prim. I mean, she read beautifully and almost without, never with a fault that I ever saw, but they were expected to be prim and starchy, and we were supposed to really, as you say, loosen your collars, put your feet up, sort of.
And now you look at the way the news and the breakfast programs are presented now. Do you sort of feel a bit of pride? You know, we started this off.
I mean, I feel particular pride and pleasure actually seeing the number of women involved both in hard news and in sport, because there were relatively few of us in either hard news. Well, there was nobody obviously in sport apart from commentators and one or two reporters. But as far as presenting sport goes, and it was quite daunting. The trouble with being the only woman in something, or I mean, there was myself and Helen Rollison, who was a very good friend, was doing she did some of the Olympics reporting and presenting when I was doing the 1988 Olympics, presenting with Bob Wilson for BBC. But we'd been friendly for quite a while. We'd come upon one another at, you know, when reporting on things and commentating. And we both would exchange sort of confidences, really. We both felt a bit like two smallish people in a bar trying to attract the attention of the of the barman and get a drink, and a sort of broad string of male backs ranged across the bar. I mean, we were lucky to have had the chance to get in there, but I mean, it was quite a stuttery progress. I mean, you see, I mean, Sue Barker, who I'd known, she was a much better tennis player than I ever was, and a near contemporary of mine as a junior player.
Yeah.
You know, she had a sort of stop-start beginning to her career, and it took her a while to get established.
Yeah.
I mean, I think she was presenting Grandstand, and she happened to confuse Queen's Park with Queen's Park Rangers, which obviously to a football buff was absolute anathema. But it's something anybody can do in the heat of the moment. We've all made mistakes. I've made endless mistakes. She got absolutely hauled over the coals for it, people being really cruel. And people would be much, much tougher on a woman doing presenting or even reading about a particular sport. I mean, I used to get sort of 15 pages of well-reasoned abuse in green ink on what looked like lavatory paper the time I read the rugby league results out. And I probably knew not a lot less about rugby league than most of my colleagues who were not rugby league specialists either, but they were males, so they were allowed to read the rugby league results without.
I mean, I wish we could go on for a lot longer. Unfortunately, time is going to run away with us again. But I wanted to get it. I mean, that's how the broadcasting world has changed, and you were at the forefront of women being taken seriously as sports reporters and as TV presenters. I wonder what your thoughts are about the way women's sport has gone in the time. We just a few days ago, the Lionesses played the World Cup final. We've had England Rugby Union playing to pack Twickenham. We've had the cricket team playing. I wonder what your thoughts are when you look at sport now and compare it to when you were playing, and if only I was born 20 years later or whatever. What are your feelings about it?
I think the sheer professionalism and the way it's marketed now is so fantastic. I can remember trying to get coverage of the Oxford Women's Rowing 8, and we were reduced to doing a sort of before and after shot of them all looking glamorous around the fountain of the Mercury at Christchurch College. And then one of them looking sort of hot and sweaty with their hair scraped back on the river. I mean, these days, people would be absolutely outraged to be made to do that sort of, oh, they're pretty little things, really. But it was the only way we could get them into a national newspaper. It was the same with the hockey women. No, they would always sort of market whoever the sort of attractive or articulate one was. And there was a reason why Sharon Davis is the only sort of memorable voice and face from the 80s, because she, being somebody who was attractive and liked the limelight and was willing to do that, was very much more marketable, because people, that was what they chose then. These days, people don't give a monkey's what people look like. They're looking for people who are amazing at their sport, who are really articulate and can really give something. And I think that the wonderful way, I mean, I'm a great netball follower because I always played it, to a reasonable level. And I mean, to see the way that the that netball, always considered a bit of a sort of namby sport that was played by the ones that weren't good enough for hockey. Seeing our girls, even though they didn't beat Australia in the finals, seeing the way that most of them are professional, the standard of the actual sports of all of them, netball, cricket, hockey, football, whatever, gone through the roof. And